How y'all doing? It's Jared. It's a Microtech Signature Series Combat Troodon. I freaking love that color. It's so dope. They call it turquoise, but it's actually blue. There's a lot of really cool colors. The purple that's in there, it's all freaking awesome, right? This is a 2016 production Tri-Grip Ultratech. Coming to focus so you can see that 2016. There's the serial number. A little bit of beat up on the pocket clip. I freaking love this knife. I've had this thing for a long time. The Tri-Grip models were only produced for a little bit. They've done different textures and different variations in the actual pattern over time. They've changed it up a bit, but I'm going to disassemble these things, just do a little bit of a comparison between the Combat Troodon and the actual Ultratech here. I will pull out my little toolkit. They are the same screw, which this I actually got with my, my Tachyon 3. All right, I'll use, I'm going to root into my little box here to see what I can find and use this. Stick it in here, break this thing apart. So I'm going to strip all these screws out. Well, hopefully I don't strip them out, but I'm going to take it apart, break it out, come back to you. Listen to how freaking cool this sounds. Can you hear that? That just sounds so dope. The aluminum, screw coming out of aluminum, where it's got a little bit of hollow ring to it because the internals on this thing just sounds freaking cool, right? Some mechanical nerd stuff there. So I'm going to hold on my button here, make sure that doesn't go flying off. Take my scale off relatively carefully so I don't actually lose my chassis. I'll pull off my button. Pull off the little spring chassis there. Set the knife down. Do the same thing with this one. Hold that button down. The Ultratech doesn't want to come apart. So what I'm going to do is just get my fingernail jammed up in there. Pull the top scale off. Same thing. Remove that little chassis. Take my button off. It's not like I'm going to get them confused. Completely different colors here. And I can actually remove the blade on this Ultratech, which I cannot do on this Combat Troodon. That pin just doesn't want to come out of there. It's not pressed in. I can actually spin it. I don't know if you can see that. I can actually spin it. You know, I can move that pin around. And so I know that it's not permanently affixed. But you can kind of actually see a little bit of like marking right there at the front of it, right there on the front of the blade. And I have actually tried, I've gotten some tools in there and tried to get it to move. I can get it to move a little tiny bit, but it just doesn't want to come out. And it's not something I want to force, you know what I mean? I think I paid like $720 for this knife. That's just not something I actually want to force to get out of there. I probably could, but I'm just not going to do it. So the blade kind of stays in here. You can see that little locking spring, right? If you're not familiar, that's actually how this thing works. It's got that little locking lever, comes down and actually secures the blade in place, right? And you can see that they're the same size. There's actually not a whole lot of difference in, the thickness of the steel. I do believe that that is probably the same steel stock. The Ultratech is a little bit longer, which, doesn't actually have anything to do, I don't think that actually comes into play, as far as durability or strength. But you can see the amount of aluminum here, the amount of aluminum that's sitting behind that little lock bar, and the Ultratech and the Combat Troodon here. The Combat Troodon is just a little bit thicker. It's a little bit beefier. There's a little bit more aluminum actually supporting that little steel lock bar. And I do think that actually comes into play as far as the overall strength and just, durability you can beat on these things. But you can see it is basically the same design here. It's the same deal in the back. The locking mechanism in the back is relatively the same. The chassis are different. I'll actually throw this one down here. The spring chassis here, you can see this is the actual spring chassis. That little piece is falling off, right? You see the size of this in comparison to, take that thing apart, pull this one off. So there's the Combat Troodon and the Ultratech. It's bigger. It's a lot bigger. Same piece, same design, same functionality. It does the exact same thing, but just bigger. Bigger, heavier, stronger, more steel. And the same thing with the chassis here. This chassis The spring chassis itself is much larger on the Combat Troodon, not just in size and size, and width there, but the actual thickness of it here. You can see just the overall thickness, and so that itself is just, I don't think comes into play, honestly, I wouldn't think comes too much into play on, the strength or the, the durability of the overall knife, because really what is this part doing besides supporting the spring? But this is adding just a lot of overall structure to the knife. You can definitely tell that, but I mean, it's the same part, same basic design. You can see a little bit of alterations up here, in design. They fitted it to the actual knife. It's not the exact same piece. It's not 100% just sized up, but it is operating. I mean, it's doing the exact same thing in these two knives. And it's not very difficult to mix up these parts either. They're not really interchangeable. You can see the spring as well. This is the Combat Troodon here. Thicker. It's just a little bit thicker around. It's a little bit actually thicker steel stock, and the spring itself is wider. See that? And so there's just more steel here. It's not it's not a massive difference, but there is definitely a difference in just the tension and the overall spring size, as well as you can see that it's kind of a different color, which I don't know if that is indicative of anything itself. It may be a difference in the actual heat treatment or the material, whatever the actual steel alloy it is itself. It could just be because this one's from 2016, this one's from 2019, and it's had a chance to oxidize more over time. Who knows? Set this thing back up, make sure my little screws or my little plate is attached. Same thing on the back. Hook that little screw on there. Come on. This one doesn't want to fit. Make sure they're sitting the right side there. Come on, man. Work with me here. It was hard to get on, and then it just falls off. What is that crap? See that? Hard to get on. What am I doing? You want that fat section to come up off the front. Oh, man, I put it on backwards. Come on. Go in there. Come on. Click into place. So I'm actually going to do this side first because it's being a pain. And click. Slide that thing up. Assembled. Do the same thing. This one here. Make sure it's in the right orientation. I want it sitting this way. Get on there. Yep. You want the fat section towards the front. And the way that is easiest to remember that is that the fatter section opposed to the little L-bend bar, right, is, I'll put this back aside on, the little L-bend bar wraps all the way around the back of the blade, right? So when this thing is sitting in here, close this thing down. When this thing's actually sitting in here, it's got to ride, it's got to ride like that. And so that back section, that little back L, is longer. It actually loops around the back of the blade and hooks onto the back of the blade, and that's what gives you your forward thrust. But that little pin, the little fat section, is actually only connecting onto the little bar, right? It's only connecting onto that little pin that's actually in the blade itself. And that's what's giving you your reverse thrust, your closing pressure. And so you can just, it's always easier to tell. You can't, it won't fit if you have it the other way around. It will fit, and you can assemble it, kind of, but it just doesn't really work right, and you can do some damage to the knife. So you want to make sure that spring is just sitting in the proper orientation there. I'm going to make sure my blade is still free floating. Listen to this. Look at that. Perfect fit. Just clips on there. Oh, God. Oh, man, that is just sexy, sexy. Spring. Stick my little button on. Hold it down. Stick that clamshell on. I love the sound. I don't know what it is about that, but this... that's some serious, like, knife nerd crap. considering the actual consideration of the sound it makes being assembled and disassembled. Running good. I'll stick the rest of the screws back in that thing in a minute. So the Ultratech, I like that blade. That's just a cool blade by itself. It's a neat thing. See, most of the steel, 90% of the steel is actually in the back end of this thing. Set that in there. Place your little chassis on. Top, except I need my button. And make sure the little spring is sitting in the hole. Stick the button on. That one doesn't quite just fall into place, but you know, whatever. What did I do wrong here? Who knows? You know what I just did? I just made a ballistic knife is what I just did. Watch my Ultratech, or you know, OTF into ballistic knife video if you want to see what would happen if I'd have deployed this knife. I've done that. It doesn't work nearly as well as you might hope. Snap that into place. Little forward screw. And it's interesting, you can see the residue of red Loctite. I don't know if it's going to come across on these holes, right? And that was from the factory. I've put blue Loctite. The residue from the blue Loctite that you can see is me. The red Loctite was actually from Microtech. I did have to break all of these screws free to actually disassemble this knife initially. The first time originally. That's actually funny. A little piece just came off of that screw. A little piece of red Loctite just came off of that screw. But you know, I haven't actually applied any Loctite to the combat Troodon, and that's why the screws are just flowing a little bit easier. I don't honestly think it's necessary, as long as they're snug, and I keep an eye on it, make sure that, you know, these screws don't go anywhere. I honestly don't think Loctite is necessary on these screws. It is a good thing, but yeah, as well as I am running all of my OTFs dry now, that's kind of a new development. I used to lube them, and the blade does fire faster. It hits harder with lubricant in it, but I've run into problems. If you've seen my Ultratech, I've got a couple disassembly videos of this Ultratech where it's not firing correctly, and all of those issues that I've had, I do believe, are just because the lube has built up so much of the crap. You know what I mean? All of the crap and all of the gunk that's floating around in my pocket or in my boot, wherever I'm carrying this thing, is, you know what I mean, collecting in there and actually stalling out the blade. And so I haven't had a problem since I stopped putting lube in these OTF knives. I haven't had a problem with this. It's just sitting pretty, and it hasn't had a hiccup since, and I've never had a hiccup out of this thing since I opened it up and cleaned all the factory lube out of it. But that's it. Y'all have a good one.